can enact in that plan and communicate to the American people that we have laid up good plan for the future in terms of how to deal with our deficit, and that we can bring some certainty to the future and get our economy back on its right track. With that, Mr. President, I will yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to express my thoughts and my concerns about an issue of the utmost importance, and that is the Israel-Palestinian peace process. Tomorrow, September 13th, 2011, the General Assembly of the United Nations will commence with its 66th session in New York. Every year, member nations come together to debate and to discuss the important issues facing the world at the United Nations General Assembly. While there will be a variety of issues on the agenda this year, I'm extremely concerned about one issue specifically. Over the last several months, Palestinian Authority President Abbas has repeatedly voiced his intention to formally request statehood recognition and full membership in the United Nations. In July, the Arab League endorsed this irresponsible ploy. Regrettably, President Abbas intends to make the formal request during this session of the United Nations General Assembly. I oppose the decision of the Palestinian Authority to seek a declaration of statehood by the United Nations. The unilateral action of the Palestinian Authority is intended to circumvent the peace process. It is not a good faith effort to achieve peace in the Middle East, but to me, rather, it is a political maneuver. The United Nations should not be interfering or intervening in this complex process and should refrain from passing unilateral declarations on issues that are part of ongoing direct negotiations by the parties. The decision about borders and statehood should be achieved through a final agreement, an agreement between the government of Israel and the Palestinians. The United Nations should refrain from dictating and imposing a final decision on statehood for a territory of one of its own current member nations. To me, this will only make matters worse. It will make the situation worse because the consequences to the peace process are grave. The ability to move forward with an agreement is weakened and greatly diminished by these types of tactics. The best path to peace is through direct negotiations between the two parties, not through a manipulation at the United Nations. The United States continues to support a two-state solution as a means to ending the conflict. It's based on the belief that it is the only way to achieve a true and lasting peace between these two countries. Instead of embarking on the time-consuming campaign to gain support in the United Nations General Assembly, the Palestinian leadership should be working directly with Israel on creating a real and sustainable peace agreement. The quest for recognition by the United Nations is part of a terrible emerging trend from the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority continues to engage in troubling behavior that is contrary to peace. On May 4th, the Palestinian Authority reached an agreement with the terrorist group Hamas to create a unity government. It is outrageous that the Palestinian Authority would be willing to unite with a known terrorist group who is infamously recognized for their destructive acts of violence. Since 1997, Hamas has been designated by the United States Department of State as a foreign terrorist organization. Hamas terrorists are responsible for the murders of American citizens. It is also important to note that the agreement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority does not require Hamas to recognize Israel's right to exist, to accept the previous Israel-Palestinian agreements, or to renounce terrorism. Hamas continues to be fundamentally opposed to a lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It is apparent that there is no path to a peaceful resolution when part of the Palestinian Unity Government is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made this point very clear when he addressed the joint session of Congress on May 24th of this year. He stated, "Peace can only be negotiated with partners committed to peace." Furthermore, it is completely unacceptable for the United States assistance to go to the Palestinian Authority when it includes Hamas. The Palestinian Authority received approximately $500 million in U.S. foreign assistance in fiscal year 2010. Hard-earned U.S. taxpayer funds must not be funneled into the pockets of terrorists. History shows that this is not the first attempt by the Palestinians to use the United Nations to circumvent peace negotiations and declare statehood. The Palestinians sought to change their status at the United Nations through the World Health Organization. At that time, Secretary of State James Baker publicly warned that he would recommend that the United States stop funding any international organization that changed the Palestinian status as an observer organization. Americans are keenly aware that a significant portion of the United Nations budget is paid by the United States. As the biggest financial contributor to the United Nations, the United States contributed almost $7.7 billion in fiscal year 2010 to the United Nations system. The United States should not be providing funding for an international institution that circumvents an established peace process and threatens the security of our allies. The United States and Israel share a long and a deep alliance. Israel is a friend, an ally, and a strategic partner to the United States. Both Israel and the United States understand the values of life, liberty, opportunity, security, and freedom. Throughout Israel's history, the country has worked to build a democratic nation in the face of severe obstacles. Israel is a shining example of democracy in the Middle East. As Israel faces real danger from its neighbors, the people of Israel continue to show great strength and perseverance as they seek peace. On May 22nd, President Obama explained that no vote at the United Nations would create an independent Palestinian state. On May 25th, the President expressed his concern about the efforts of the Palestinian Authority to seek statehood at the United Nations and referred to it as a mistake. The Department of State continues to reiterate that Israel and the Palestinian Authority need to work out the difference between themselves in direct negotiations. The United States has been very clear that we will use veto power in the United Nations Security Council to block any attempt by the Palestinians for state recognition or United Nations membership. The Obama administration must use all of its resources to block similar actions in the General Assembly and other United Nations organizations. President Obama and Secretary Clinton must press the Palestinian Authority to abandon its erroneous decision and return to the negotiating table with Israel. It is also imperative that other international leaders understand the implications of these efforts and join the United States in opposing them. Nations must stand together to decry the attempt to circumvent direct peace process negotiations. The Palestinian Authority must also understand that its actions will have serious implications to the U.S.-Palestinian relations and to U.S. assistance. The recent actions of the Palestinian Authority indicate that this senator and indicate to me that the United States has no choice but to suspend funding assistance to the Palestinian Authority. Today, I call on Congress to terminate funding assistance to the Palestinian Authority, and I believe Congress must also evaluate and significantly cut funding to the United Nations if any change to the status of the Palestinian Authority is approved by the General Assembly. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
dispensed with?
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, President Obama is about to roll out another jobs plan. He talked about it last week. This is 2.5 years after the first stimulus bill, which with interest amounted to about $1.2 trillion. And his economic advisors have confirmed the fact that this stimulus concept is actually based on Keynesian economic theory. And as our Republican leader noted last week, unfortunately, there are now 1.7 million fewer jobs in America, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, than there were before the President's first stimulus bill. So the question, obviously, is whether this theory is better in theory than it is in practice. And I wanted to talk today a little bit about the two different basic theories of economic growth and what you do in a situation of economic downturn like we have today. How should we be looking at stimulation of job creation and economic growth? The two competing theories, of course, are the Keynesian theory that I mentioned and what some have called supply-side economics. There's no question that the Keynesian theory has been one that the President's economic advisors generally adhere to. It was used to justify the 2009 stimulus program. And other programs, for example, the one that sticks out in my mind is the so-called cash for clunkers. But there were other transfer payment government programs, temporary tax credits, and others. But the theory here, and the cash for clunkers is a good example, is that in recessionary time, if the government spends money and gives it to people so that they can spend it, that will therefore stimulate consumption, that business will respond by increasing production, and that will create jobs. And recently, for example, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack said that because of a theoretical multiplier effect under this model, food stamps, government money taken from taxpayers given to people who are entitled or eligible for food stamps, that they would actually stimulate the economy by a factor of 1.84, or in other words, that $1 of food stamps would actually generate $1.84 in economic activity. There are a lot of problems with that theory. The first is that the multiplier effect itself has been discredited as not something that, in fact, actually happens. A Harvard economist by the name of Robert Barrow has explained this, and let me just quote from one of the things he read. Theorizing aside, Keynesian policy conclusions such as the wisdom of additional stimulus geared to money transfers should come down to empirical evidence. And there is zero evidence that deficit-financed transfers raise GDP and employment, not to mention evidence for a multiplier of 2 if Secretary Vilsack's claim were valid. This result would be truly miraculous. The administration found the evidence it wanted, multipliers around 2, by consulting some large-scale macroeconometric models which substitute assumptions for identification, end of quote. In other words, economists can prove the multiplier in theory with these models, but there's no empirical evidence that it's ever occurred. It's a bit like money growing on trees. The money has to come from somewhere, and of course it comes out of the pockets of taxpayers, or the government borrows it and it eventually has to be repaid with taxpayer tax dollars. The second problem is that to the extent that one assumes that the problem is that Americans are too broke to spend money, the question then is, well, how can the government make that up for us? Aren't the people the government? Doesn't the government get its money from the people in the form of taxes, or if it borrows, people's taxes eventually have to pay back the borrowed money? In other words, we have to pay it back later. Third, people tend to change their spending habits when they know that they will have greater consistent income over time, like when they receive a raise at work. If you just give people a one-time payment, the evidence has shown that they either save that or they shift future consumption forward. In other words, They may buy something now that they were going to buy later. That's where the Cash for Clunkers program failed. But it doesn't permanently increase their work effort or their incentive to invest, which of course is exactly what's needed to jumpstart economic growth. Like the job creators themselves, they tend to hire when they know that they're going to have permanent tax relief or regulatory relief, not just when they receive a one-time payment for something. That's only for as good as it lasts, for as long as it lasts. But it doesn't provide the consistent long-term prospect for income, for example, that they need in order to take the step of actually hiring a person, committing to pay that person over time. Fourth, Keynesian theory assumes the government has the foresight to determine, or as President Obama's former National Economic Council Chief Larry Summers said of the stimulus, to target which spending programs would best create economic growth. But that rarely happens. The obvious problem with this assumption is that Congress does not spend taxpayer money wisely. We see time and time again how a well-intentioned piece of legislation gets loaded up with special projects, frequently which are costly to the public and very questionable in their value. And that was one of the things that was wrong with the stimulus package itself. There's an eye-opening new set of working papers that reveals the truth about this. Mercatus Center scholars Garrett Jones and Daniel Rothschild took a look in the study, among other things, at whether Congress did a good job of targeting the stimulus funds at unemployed workers and weak sectors of the economy. They surveyed hundreds of firms that received stimulus funding and gathered more than 1,000 voluntary anonymous responses from employees and managers to help shed more light on what happened to organizations that received stimulus funds. And here's what they write, quote, "Our survey finds no evidence of such Keynesian targeting occurring, at least not successfully." End of quote. For example, one city was given $4 million to improve energy efficiency, even though a budget shortfall had just forced it to lay off 185 public workers. In another case study, a federal contractor was instructed to purchase more expensive tiles than he needed for a particular project. The theory was that in that way the government could claim that the stimulus money was getting out the door faster. This isn't the way to spur economic growth. And I think even most Keynesians believe it matters what the government actually spends its money on. Moreover, this study that I referred to also found that less than half of those hired with stimulus funds were unemployed, about 42.1%. Jobs were simply moving from one place to another. The authors of the study wrote, and I quote, "Hiring is not the same thing as net job creation. This suggests just how hard it is for Keynesian job creation to work in a modern expertise-based economy," end of quote. In other words, while an employer might steal an employee from another employer, that's not the same thing as creating a net new job. So the bottom line here is there's a major misconception that consumption fueled by government spending actually creates jobs. It turns out that it doesn't. It just inefficiently moves borrowed money around with a bill that has to be repaid later. I think it's also important to remember that economic growth stems from combining three inputs: labor, capital, and technology. These three factors of production result in output that we can then consume. And this is the beginning of the difference between the Keynesian philosophy and the supply-side philosophy, which focuses on productivity. And what is required for society to be more productive? Labor, capital, and technology. And properly applied, when these three aspects of an economy are well aligned, the economy can grow, jobs can be produced, people will consume, but they will be consuming things that have been produced by the businesses of the country. Without labor, capital, and technology, there can be no consumption. I mean, that's obvious. Focusing on policies that stimulate consumption targets the wrong side of the equation. In order to get the economy going, you need to focus on the inputs. And there's an incidental problem here. Stimulating consumption also raises prices, which is exactly what we don't need. When you stimulate input or productivity, you produce more of the quality goods that people want, and the prices of those products are down, if there's enough productivity. But when you try to stimulate consumption for a fixed number of goods, obviously the price of those goods goes up. There is a fear of inflation in our society today, and that's precisely what this kind of Keynesian stimulus will produce. And this matter of focusing on inputs, as I said, is where the second philosophy of economic growth comes in, supply-side economics, which focuses on productivity. The fundamental principle of supply-side economics is that people work harder and they take more risks when there are more opportunities for economic gain and less government intrusion. Translating this economic philosophy into policy means several things. First of all, reducing government consumption by cutting spending, thus leaving resources in the private sector. When the government spends money, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to continue to speak for as long as the time I may consent.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
Thank you. When the government can only spend money, I mentioned food stamps before, the government can only give money to a food stamp recipient by taxing that money from someone else or from borrowing the money, and eventually that borrowed money needs to be paid back. How is it paid back? It's paid back by taxpayers paying money to the government, which can then repay its debts. In either event, eventually, the money that the government spends to stimulate the economy has to come from somewhere. And the only place it can come from is the American taxpayer. So the bottom line is, with Keynesian stimulus spending, there is no free lunch. The money doesn't just materialize out of nowhere. It's not free for the government to inject this money into the economy by giving it to favored groups or to redistribute it to people within our society so that they can spend it. And that's why this factor that some people talk about, that we actually get more money back than we put in, is wrong in two ways. First, as I pointed out before, there's no empirical evidence that that ever happened. And secondly, eventually the money has to be repaid. Or if it was taxpayer money to begin with, that's $1 less taxpayer money that taxpayer has to invest or to consume, or if it's a business person, to hire someone in the private business. The bottom line is that government money isn't free. And so the whole premise of Keynesian economics, that we get a free dollar someplace and that produces benefits by people then spending it, is wrong. How about leaving it in the pocket of the person who we want to spend it in the first place? Chances are that that person can make a more intelligent decision about what he or she needs than the United States government. And second, as I said here, we're talking about incentives in the marketplace which are based by every economic study on long-term policies, long-term tax policies, long-term regulatory policies. An individual small businessman, for example, wants to know what the law will be 2 and 3 and 4 years out before he decides to hire a new employee that he's going to have to pay taxes for, that he's going to have to provide potentially a health benefit for, certainly a salary. And if he doesn't think that government policy over that long term is going to enable him to continue to employ the individual, he's not going to hire him in the first place. Another thing that supply-side economics means is that the worst thing you could do, especially in economic downtimes, is to raise taxes on anyone, but certainly not on the very employers who we count on to hire more workers. And who is it, Mr. President, that are the first to hire coming out of a recession? It's small business. So the very people that we are asking to hire more Americans to put them back to work are the people who would be impacted by the taxes that the President talked about the other night. He's talking about taxing, quote, wealthier Americans. What does that mean? That means people who make incomes of above $200,000. And that happens to be the group that represents the bulk of the small business entrepreneurs in America. 50% of all small business income is paid in those top 2 income tax brackets that the President would raise taxes on. So the very people we want to hire more workers, we're going to impose more taxes on. And then we are going to expect them to hire more, to reduce unemployment so that we can have greater economic growth. It simply doesn't work that way. And the final point has to do with regulations. More and more, the President seems to be acknowledging that the runaway regulations of his administration are actually beginning to harm business and job creation. This is why he has announced his effort to try to streamline the regulations and get rid of any that don't work, why he withdrew a proposed regulation from the Environmental Protection Agency recently that would have had a very negative impact on business. He's beginning to recognize that his administration is a big wet blanket over businesses these days because of the burden of regulations. You cannot stimulate the economy or job growth with the government imposing more and more costly regulations on American business every day. Now, the President set up a false choice in his speech the other night. He said, we've got to do away with these job-killing regulations. But he said, I will not do away with the regulations which protect the American people from, and then he named a litany of things that he wants to protect the American people from. Well, nobody's talking about eliminating all regulations or, having unsafe food or unsafe products for little babies or the like. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the issuance of thousands and thousands of pages of new regulations every month by this administration, and an extraordinary cost on American business with very little regard for a cost benefit. In other words, how much society benefits versus the cost of these regulations imposed on business. And by the way, when I say the cost imposed on business, who pays? Business are the people in the business. And the consumers end up paying the cost of the regulations, which obviously are passed on. So this is, again, another indirect tax on the American people. And that's why I said before, no tax, but especially in a time like this, whether direct or indirect, is a good idea because of the negative impact it has on job creation. So the bottom line of all of this, Mr. President, is that there are two basic theories. The one theory basically says you can get something for nothing. The government will just get money, forget where it gets it. But when it gives it to people, they'll spend it, and when they spend it, then whatever they spend it on, that producer has to produce more of those things, so they'll have to hire somebody to make more of them. But that's exactly backwards. It doesn't work that way. The supply side theory says, first of all, the money didn't come to the government free. It had to be taken out of the private sector. The government either had to tax somebody, so they have $1 less to spend, or it gives an IOU, which means that eventually the taxpayers have to pay the taxes to repay the IOU. In either case, that's $1 taken out of the economy. It's $1 not there in the private sector for an entrepreneur to hire someone with or to produce something. And so supply-side economics says, let's look at the other side of the equation. Rather than focusing on consumption, let's focus on productivity, where technology, labor, and capital can produce more, can make a society more productive, more wealthy, where more people can have work, they can have better paying jobs, what they produce has greater value, and people are willing to buy it, as a result of which they put more money back into the economy, and that's the cycle that produces wealth. And it's the cycle that has caused economic growth and job creation and wealth generation in this country now for over 200 years. It begins with the proposition that job growth starts in the private sector. The government doesn't create jobs. That money starts with the people, the taxpayers. They generate the income, and the government gets a piece of that in the way of tax revenue, but the money belongs to the people, not the government. And third, that there's no magic when the government somehow gets $1 in order to redistribute it so somebody can buy something with it. You have to remember where the $1 came from. It didn't materialize out of thin air. It started with a hard-working taxpayer that earned the $1 and then either paid it to the government in taxes or is paying it in taxes to repay a debt that the government incurred in order to borrow money for a stimulus package. As we think about the President's proposed stimulus, third or fourth stimulus, however you count it now, I hope we can keep these economic theories in mind. There is no free lunch. There is no free money. Eventually, the taxpayers are who creates the wealth, and the job creators create the jobs. And if we keep those principles in mind, I think we will look a little bit more skeptically on the notion that we can just somehow target job creation with yet another stimulus bill, and that that's going to get us out of our economic woes now. If my colleagues will keep these principles in mind, I think we'll make wise decisions and prevent the country from going even deeper into debt and try to focus on the long term so that businesses can actually make decisions based upon long-term thinking rather than based upon the ephemeral effects of short-term stimulus.
Mr. President, Senator from Wyoming.